Hello and welcome to the DaveCast for Thursday, August 24th. The year is 2020, and we are studying the letter of James. Back on Tuesday, we talked about some of the background information about how this letter, that it's written by Jesus' brother James, probably around the year 55 AD. We also talked a little bit about the audience for this letter, that they were Jewish Christians who had been living in Jerusalem in dispersion, or around Jerusalem in dispersion, I should say. And I thought we'd begin today by reading that account where that happened from the book of Acts, chapter 8. And so just to give you a little more context, just before this section that I'm going to read, in the last few verses of chapter 7, Stephen has been stoned to death, becoming one of the first Christian martyrs. And so that's where we're going to pick it up in chapter 8, verse 1. And it says, and Saul approved of their killing him. On that day, a great persecution broke out against the church in Jerusalem, and all except the apostles were scattered throughout Judea and Samaria. Godly men buried Stephen and mourned deeply for him. But Saul began to destroy the church, going from house to house. He dragged off men, both men and women, and put them in prison. Okay, so who is this Saul? Do you know? I'll give you a hint. His name was later changed. Yeah, I'm sure you either knew already or figured it out. This is Saul, whose name was later changed to Paul. But this obviously was before his conversion on the Damascus road, where he was a notorious persecutor of these Jewish Christians. And I keep mentioning that they were Jewish Christians because that's how the Christian movement began. It had not yet been opened up very much to Gentiles. And so this was also a time when there was still a lot of attention that was being paid to keeping the Torah among these Jewish Christians. And so this is going to pop up from time to time as we study the letter of James. He refers to that. All right, then, let's get back to the James text. I left off on Tuesday in chapter 1, verse 5. That's actually where I also want to pick it up today and unpack that verse a little bit more. So we're going to start there with chapter 1, verse 5. And it says, "If any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you." Okay, so as we have seen James talking to this scattered flock, this dispersed church, and helping them to know how, as believing people, they're supposed to go through these trials and persecution. James reminds them of what God is doing in the midst of the various difficulties with which we ourselves are dealing. He knows that they may feel that they lack wisdom about God and about how to proceed through their trials with God. And so he encourages them to ask God and reminds them of God's character. He builds their faith and hope in God by helping them to see again that God is a giving God, a God who gives generously to all and does not reproach. James knows how difficult that this is, and to count on God when they're unsure about God's character. And so by seeing God clearly and realizing God's goodness and mercy, then one's trust toward God is drawn out. And so next, James gives a warning in verse 6 to reinforce from the other side, the opposite of what he has just said. He says, but when you ask, you must believe and not doubt, because the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea, blown and tossed by the wind. And so what does James mean here? He is saying that we must somehow make ourselves have no... Well, is he saying? Is he saying that we shouldn't have a shadow of doubt in our minds? You know, when we pray to God, is that what he's saying? That God will only listen to respond to us if we have this sort of perfect faith? Well, no, the answer is no. This is definitely not what James is saying. I mean, he's already told them to ask God if they lack wisdom. And he assumes that they'll be struggling as they go through these trials and they won't have it all together. He said that these trials test their faith. It's in the midst of this difficulty sometimes, though, that we become unsure. that we can lose sight of who God is, and we're tempted not to count on God and live as if God is present and active. And so telling them just to have perfect faith, that wouldn't have been helpful. In fact, that would have been the opposite of helpful. That would have been discouraging them. And so let's look a little more closely at this passage and see how James defines what he means by doubting. In verse 6, he describes the one who doubts as being like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. So one who is doubting is someone without any anchor, which is very different than one who has an anchor but is struggling to trust that it still works, that it still holds. The person who has no anchor has no discernment, and so he's blown around by the waves, So let's look at verse 7 and verse 8. It says, that person should not expect to receive anything from the Lord. Such a person is double-minded and unstable in all they do. This person without an anchor. So a double-minded person, another way to say that is literally having two minds. So such a person could be kind of double-minded about their request to God. In other words, they may say they really want God's best, but they have their hearts. In their hearts, they have something set on something else, something far less. Or most likely, the double-minded person may also be double-minded about whether or not they trust God in the midst of their trial. They may also be equally counting on something else besides God to get them through this trial. For example, their own strength and ingenuity. Now, this is not so much because God won't give it to him, because remember, James has just been telling his readers that God's a generous giver. Now, the problem is with the one who is praying. James is saying is that when we ask God for wisdom and help, but are really looking for help to come from somewhere else, then we cannot receive from God. We do not end up, in other words, seeing what God is doing, and so we don't receive that wisdom from God for the trial that we are living through, because we are not really counting on God. We are counting on ourselves. And therefore, we put ourselves in a position where we are unable to receive these generous gifts he desires to give. And that is to grow in faith and spiritual maturity. Those are the best gifts. And so in that case, that person should ask the question, well, who gave you that intellect? Who gave you that ability for perseverance? Who gave you that ingenuity? It's when we see those things that we can grow in wisdom. It reminds me of the story of the man on the roof of his house. It's in the midst of a rising flood. The flood waters are rolling in, and he cries out to God. He makes all kinds of promises. If God will just rescue him, that he will promise to do these things. And then suddenly this small boat comes floating up. And the man looks back up in heaven. He says, oh, never mind, God. I'll just take this boat. James is saying that when we are in a time of trial, whether large or small, to ask in faith, to hand everything over to God, even our doubts, even our misgivings. Turn it all over to God. Let me ask you this. Do you ever struggle with doubts when you're praying? Because I think we all can do that from time to time. There's a story in Mark where a man brings this little boy to him for Jesus for healing. And the little boy obviously has epilepsy or something, and he has these seizures. And the man tells Jesus that he's suffered with this his whole life. And so Jesus asks the man, do you believe? Now, the man's kind of caught, right? I mean, obviously the right answer is yes, I believe. But the man also knows that Jesus can see his heart and see that he does have a tinge of doubt. And so he says something really great. He says, yes, I believe. Help me in my unbelief. What a great prayer. What a faithful, honest prayer. When I think about the wisest people I know, when I think about the most faithful people I know, it is people who have been through some stuff. It is people whose lives have not been easy, but they have learned to trust God and to see God at work in all of those trials. Their great wisdom has come as a result of the trials. And so I don't know what you might be facing personally this week, But I do know it's been a very difficult year for all of us, and there's undoubtedly going to be more difficulties ahead. And so regardless of wherever you might find yourself on life's journey today, remember this. God does not give us overcoming life. He gives us life as we overcome. The strain of life is what builds our strength. It's where we grow strong in our wisdom. If there is no strain, there will be no strength. And look, I know when you're in the midst of struggle and adversity is all around you, it's hard. You don't even know where to begin. And so if that's you, in that case, consider this. If you are having trouble getting started, if you find yourself struggling with doubt, remember these great words of encouragement from St. Francis of Assisi. He said, start by doing what's necessary, then do what's possible. And suddenly, you are doing the impossible. I mean, those are such great words. I love St. Francis. Well, all right, that's it for this Thursday. But I'll be back with a Saturday edition of the DaveCast this weekend. But until then, you be safe. Keep bringing the hope, and I will see you then. God bless you.